4 weeks had passed since I, a German soldier, a former prisoner of war, had accepted the offer to become a Russian soldier. I was still encouraged by this strange change in my fortunes, but the pleasure of it had gone down. I was by no means out of danger. My battalion commander was promoted, and from commander of a penitentiary unit to commander of a combat battalion at the front. His place was taken by a captain. I was still addressed as a senior lieutenant, although many of my buddies in the camp guard said I should have a higher rank. I learned that the Russian prisoners were very interested in anyone in the camp. I often heard them wash their bones in detail about their fellow prisoners and officers. In my opinion, these people had nothing else to occupy themselves particularly, but it seems to me that the desire to know everyone and everything you encounter is a characteristic feature of the Russians. One evening, after receiving my rations, I met in Captain Tarakanov's room with him and two other officers. I was already feeling much better and had just had time for dinner. The room was warm, the prisoners were sitting quietly in their barracks. I even briefly forgot that I was still in the company of enemies, in a detention camp, and allowed myself to relax, to smoke in the pleasant company of people I had begun to consider my friends. I got on well with my fellow officers, but I always kept discreetly with them, trying to tell them as little about myself as possible. One day, Tarakanov noticed that I was not very talkative and tried to engage me in conversation. You know, he said, people in the barracks talk about you. They say, "Who is he? He doesn't look like a Russian." I can hear people saying to you, "Here comes a man in a black coat." You know that's what they call you, the man in the black coat. There was a long pause in the conversation, and then one of the officers began to say something about his charges. I breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that I was no longer the center of attention. I listened absent-mindedly, but really immersed in my own thoughts. I often heard from people around me, "Here comes a man in a black coat." And that's all I let them know about me. Some tried to talk to me and ask me questions, but I always gave them different answers. To one I appeared to be French, to another Englishman, to a third I was a Pole. In the end, no one had the slightest idea who I really was. I had to play a dangerous but also exciting game. I had to be extremely careful that no one, neither the guards nor the prisoners, found out who I was. I wondered how long I could hold out. Of course, I knew it wasn't really a game at all. It was real, and my life depended on it. This kind of talk was repeated almost every night. Lieutenant Sherapil would tell us what the soldiers said about me. Some thought I was an Englishman, a Frenchman, a Pole, but there were also those who doubted it and thought I might have been a German. I rejoiced at the mystery I had managed to create around my person and felt proud of myself. Every day Lieutenants Anishchenko and Sherapil and I made our rounds of the camp. We were always especially attentive to the part of it where the women were kept. Some of them were quite attractive, and two in particular I liked. Of course, I realized that getting close to anyone in that place would be foolish. I was, after all, in a prison camp. I remained a disciplined employee and chased extraneous thoughts away. One afternoon, when we were in our officers' barracks, Lieutenant Anishchenko suggested to me, "Let's go for a walk after lunch. There is someone new in the camp. She's only recently arrived here. She's an Army senior lieutenant, and she was sent here for supervision straight from the front. She saw us together last night and asked me about you. I think she liked you. She asked if she could meet you tonight, and I promised to arrange such a meeting." Captain Tarakanov and I became good friends. He overheard my conversation with Anishchenko. Later, when the latter came out, Tarakanov came up to me. He looked me in the eye and warned me. "Just between us, Oscar, you know about the NKVD. You should be careful." "Yes, I know what you're talking about." I touched his elbow. "Thank you for taking care of me." Later that evening, Anishchenko came into my room. I looked at him silently. He gestured that I should follow him, as it was time for a walk. I grabbed my fur coat and walked out the door with him. Soon we reached the women's barracks, barely speaking along the way. When we reached the door, the lieutenant smiled at me and said, "You'll like her." And I thought about the advice I had received from Tarakanov. I hoped that I would not do anything stupid, and at the same time I was curious and did not want to disappoint Anishchenko. Apparently, he had to overcome many obstacles to organize this meeting as a sign of favor to me. I needed to show my gratitude for it. As we approached the barracks, he knocked on the door. I saw a figure dash to the window, then disappear for a second, only to slip out of the building shortly afterward. Her name was Anna, and she was strikingly good looking, about 170 centimeters tall, a lush blonde. It had been a long time since I had seen a woman like this. I instantly decided for myself that I had done the right thing by ignoring Tarakanov's warning, as I wanted to savor the moment. And yet, with my mind, I realized that the captain was right. The girl took a few steps in our direction to join us. Anishchenko introduced me to her. Hi, she said warmly and extended her hand to me. I answered hello, accepted her hand, and politely held it in mine for a second. The girl was dressed in a new long coat, fur hat, and white scarf, but she wore no gloves. Her skin was cold but soft, and I was afraid to squeeze that thin palm too hard when our eyes met for a second. The three of us turned away from the building, choosing the right direction, and began to walk around the campground. As we stepped into the middle of the dark buildings, Anishchenko and Anna were having a lively conversation amongst themselves. The fence around the camp was lit with bright lights, but the paths inside were dark. We could see that the sentries in the towers were occasionally paying attention to us. After a few minutes, Anna tried to engage me in conversation as well. So, you are new to the camp. We walked a few more steps before she added, I heard that you are a Polish officer. True, I replied. When I said this, I didn't look at her. I tried to keep my answers as short as possible and contain as little information as possible. But Anna, apparently, decided to spur our conversation. Anishchenko fell silent, as if he had already done his job and was now just waiting for the desired result. Despite the fact that the girl was very attractive, I also realized the danger she could pose to me. Do you speak German, Oscar? She asked. I had expected such a question. I was relieved when I realized that this chance meeting had been arranged in advance. Now I could continue the conversation calmly, as I knew exactly what was going on and was in complete control. After a short pause, I answered in German. Yes, a little, but not very well. She proudly informed me that she spoke fluent German and continued our conversation in that language. I answered in broken German phrases, trying to make occasional grammatical errors, but not to make it sound like I was doing it on purpose. I never answered questions immediately to give the impression that I first needed to compose a phrase in German in my mind before issuing it out loud. I asked her how she got to this camp, and she told me in great detail that she had been sent here as an observer. The three of us talked some more until the evening drew to a close, for by 10 o'clock each of us had to be at our barracks. When it was time to part, she asked if we could meet again tomorrow night, and I agreed. Anishchenko explained that he would not be able to come, and we would have to be alone. Anishchenko and I quickly walked the short distance to our barracks. We traveled the rest of the way in silence and said goodbye as I was about to turn toward my barracks. I quickly settled down in my bunk and began to think about this meeting. I pondered where it might lead me. The next evening, I also met Anna at the entrance to her barracks. Only this time I was one-on-one with her. We immediately went for a walk, without the exchange of pleasantries that had taken place between us when we met the day before. She continued to speak to me exclusively in German, but this time she spoke little. She led us away from the well-lit perimeter, and we found ourselves in the almost unlit space between the barracks. She acted like something was really distracting her. I asked what she was thinking about. I had been thinking about something all night and all day. I was thinking about how I could escape from the camp. I still didn't answer. I thought I'd hold her in suspense for a while and see what she said next. By doing so, I was letting her know that I was in control of the situation. She excitedly continued. I'm sure the prisoners in the camp think about it all the time. But what are they thinking about? What plans can they make? It always occupies their minds, and they think about it all day long. I'm sure some of them have already discovered the weak points. Will you come with me? Will you run away with me? Just the two of us. I had in no way expected such a question, but I was beginning to realize what was going on. I'll have to think about it. Yeah, so you found a way out of here. Right now. Yeah, and I know it's going to work. Every morning at 9 o'clock, A truck comes by at 9 o'clock to bring food and some stuff to be stored in the warehouse. The driver always comes alone. He knows me, as we are fellow countrymen. He always brings a few empty barrels with him. We can climb into the truck and hide in them. And when we get out of the camp, we can go to the Caucasus, where my parents live. And there, I'll take care of everything else. I listened attentively to everything she said. She was anxiously waiting for my reaction. After I deliberately prolonged the period of silence, making her feel even more awkward, I replied, I like that. It's a smart plan. She was pleased that I seemed to agree with her. Smiling, she said, It will work, I know. But why do you want to escape from the camp? And before she could answer, I continued, I like it here, but I have heard of another camp in Moscow that is much better than this one. The life there is 100% better. Looking into her eyes, I added, and I heard that you even have a husband there. Her expression changed, and she looked at me rather apprehensively. I smiled at her again. Even though I spoke broken German, I thought she understood me. Good, she said, and we started walking again. From that point on, Anna became much less talkative. We walked back to her barracks as the evening was quickly coming to an end. She explained that she suddenly felt very tired. As we said goodbye, I asked when we could see each other again. She said nothing and silently closed the door behind her. I smiled to myself and quickly headed back to my barracks, feeling proud that I had managed to handle the situation so cleverly. The next day, that girl disappeared from the camp without a trace, and I never saw her again. Anna was not the last mysterious officer I met in that camp. There were others like her, and Captain Tarakanov had warned me about them. After only a few days of meeting me, another woman began to seek me out. She was different from the others, or perhaps I just looked at her differently after being a part of this game. It was obvious from the moment we met that she was not a prisoner. She was a petty criminal who cooperated with the GPU. I was sure of it. One afternoon during a walk, she came up to me and struck up a conversation. How are you? Fine, thank you. She moved a little closer and began to speak softly to me. Do you remember that blonde girl you met a few days ago? Yes. She's from the NKVD. She was ordered to find out as much as she could about you. But when she couldn't get anything out of you, she went back to her department. I was calm and unconcerned. I looked behind her back at the campgrounds and asked, Why are you telling me this? You work for the NKVD too, don't you? She leaned toward me and spoke softly. I will tell you if you promise to keep this between us. I don't want to stay working in this camp like you forever. I promise. Okay, Oscar. If you really want to leave this camp, you must make an official report in writing to the NKVD stating that you are a Polish officer. The NKVD will consider your report, and perhaps you will actually be able to return to the Polish army if that is what you really want. Neither of us said another word. She turned and walked away. I froze in place, and for a while I silently indulged in reflection. It was an interesting thought. Of course, I didn't trust her. Moreover, I didn't believe her on a dime, but in the end I decided that nothing bad would happen if I tried. After all, it was the NKVD that had put me here, and as strange as it sounds, it could serve as a key for me to get out of here. I asked my friend Captain Tarakanov to write this report for me, and he gladly complied with my request. Tarakanov, Anishchenko, Stolyaruk, and Nikolai Sherapil all participated, giving advice and comments. Tarakanov sent the document, and I began to wait. Eventually, my report reached the NKVD command, and I was asked for additional explanations. When I complied with this demand, the NKVD captain advised me to remain calm, as the documents had been sent to the directorate in Moscow. According to him, such matters take a long time for courier mail. So, I began to wait. One afternoon, there was some commotion in the officers' company. I did not pay attention to it, but Captain Tarakanov began to shout my name in a loud voice. Oscar, your compatriot has come to see you. When I heard this, I shuddered, and I was seized with fear that the end of my charade might suddenly turn out to be quite different from what I would like. What if they found out who I really was? I tried to pull myself together and strode nonchalantly into the officers' mess hall, where I saw a face I didn't recognize. This man's name was Bruno Schmigielski. He was 34 years old and came from Kruswitz in the Danzig area of Poland. He was short, dirty, and emaciated, like almost all the inhabitants of this camp, but he had an open, pleasant face that radiated mischief and disobedience. I learned that he had lived in Kruswitz until 1933, and then left Poland for Germany, where he settled in Potsdam. There he joined the SS and then became a Gestapo officer during the Polish campaign. After the campaign in Poland was over, he escaped from the Gestapo and traveled to Russia. He was able to navigate around well because he spoke both Russian and Polish fluently, and most importantly, because he was smart and resourceful. Brunov settled down in Dnipropetrovsk, where he tried to keep to himself without arousing suspicion and wait for the opportunity to return to Poland, where he hoped there would no longer be German troops. Unfortunately, he still aroused the suspicions of the locals, and they captured him and handed him over to the underground fighters operating in Dnipropetrovsk, who suspected him of being a spy. However, Bruno managed to convince them otherwise, and he was released after only 3 days in captivity. He left Dnipropetrovsk and, intending to drive to Lemberg, went to Kharkov. There he hoped to return to civilian life and mix with the local population, but in Kharkov he was arrested by the NKVD and ended up in prison. There he spent 6 months, as he had no documents or certificates. From there, he was sent to an NKVD camp. Here he was quarantined for 21 days, and on April 15, 1944, he was assigned to the 10th Company. That's how our paths crossed. As soon as he was in the camp, he addressed the officers with a statement that he was actually a warrant officer in the Polish army and wished to return there. In the room, Bruno was in the company of 5 other officers. One of them had a duffel bag half filled with breadcrumbs and ham, which he said some woman from the warehouse had given him. The officer who had the duffel bag slept with it in his arms all night, clutching it tightly in his hands, for he was afraid someone would steal the bag. But Bruno was a resourceful thief. He took a blade, sneaked to that officer, cut through the sack, and stole most of the groceries from there. When the officer woke up and felt that the sack was half empty, he became furious. He gathered several other officers and went to the barracks to search for the kidnapper. They soon dragged Bruno out of the group of cellmates and brought him to me to tell me what had happened. I told the aggrieved officer to make a complaint in writing, indicating also who he suspected. He replied that he had already written such a statement, accusing Bruno of what he had done. The officer handed the statement to me. I looked at Bruno and let the officers go. When all the bystanders had left and Bruno and I were alone, I approached him and asked him for his side of the story. Bruno did not try to defend himself and confessed everything at once. He looked at me and waited calmly for my reaction, as if nothing bothered him in his life and the expectation of punishment was nothing new to him. "Don't worry about anything," I told him. I took the paper and put it in the trash. I knew right away that Bruno and I were going to be good friends. I learned that Bruno was quite a character. He often told me wild stories about what he had done when he was in NKVD prison. Once, when he was in a prison cell in Kharkov, he desperately tried to find a way to get sent to the hospital, hoping to escape. At first, he decided to pretend to be sick, but that didn't work. Then he wanted someone to hurt his leg, but there were no volunteers. So one day he jumped out of a window to land on his leg and break it. Unfortunately, this trick didn't work either, and he didn't manage to break any bones, but his leg did hurt terribly afterwards. He was a real daredevil who tried all kinds of crazy things. He told me so many new things about himself and his outlook on life. I enjoyed his company and enjoyed listening to his stories, but I myself gave him almost no information about myself in return. I tried very hard not to let him know about me, who I really was. At this point, I didn't trust anyone. A few days after I first met Bruno, I noticed another person who immediately attracted my interest. It was a lieutenant from Company 11, and it was clear that he had been given the assignment to observe me. After the morning report, this officer approached me and asked if I was a Pole. I answered in the affirmative. He continued to ask if I spoke German, but I responded by saying that I spoke only a little German. I had heard this question before. The NKVD could have invented some new tactics. The lieutenant insisted that he spoke German very well, that he was a Jew. Then he began to speak to me in German, but I answered him only with phrases in a broken language. I already knew what was going on and how these games were played. The next morning, a major from the NKVD came up to me and offered me a new assignment. He saw me talking to that man from the 11th Company. He asked me to find out if he was a Jew, where he had recently lived and worked. The major told me that he had heard that lieutenant speak German very well, and he might be useful as an interpreter. Besides, he warned me that that man was armed, and there had been a case when he had not treated Russian prisoners properly. The NKVD knew that it was difficult to get anything out of that guy, but I might be the person in the camp who could get close to them. I replied to the major that I would fulfill his order. A lieutenant from the 11th Company followed me around on my heels all the next day. I concentrated on speaking broken German to him constantly. I recorded our conversations. The next day, I prepared a report for the NKVD. I pointed out that the man was Jewish and that the SS had killed his parents and sister. He worked for the Germans in a labor camp in Kiev as an interpreter. When I reported this to the NKVD major, it seemed to me that he was completely indifferent to the task I had accomplished. He said that I had done my job well and ordered me to stop watching that man. It was also familiar to me. The next day, that man suddenly disappeared from the camp, and no one saw him again. I told Captain Tarakanov what had happened. He told me again, "Oscar, from the very beginning, I told you that you must be careful. That man asked me some questions about you too. He said he was Jewish, but I spoke to him a little in Yiddish, and he didn't know how to answer me. I know that he is not a Jew at all, but just another NKVD officer." It had been almost 4 months since I arrived at the camp. The days stretched monotonously. During our evening walks with Anishchenko and Sherapil, I often fell into silence, leaving them to carry on a conversation alone. I enjoyed the familiarity and would have liked to consider them friends, but I knew I should never let my guard down and consider our friendship genuine. They often talked about their families, their plans, their views on the war, their thoughts and feelings, which allowed me to understand these men. Many times, in turn, they asked me difficult questions, but I always gave them short answers. Finally, they stopped trying and simply accepted my silent company. I felt that I was disappointing them, but after all, these were the people with whom I was a prisoner. I owed them nothing. Did that make my life safer? Maybe I should have continued to stay on the other side as a prisoner. All I had to do was survive by following the rules. It was not unreasonable for me to believe that someday the war would end and we would all be released, at least those still alive. But instead I chose comfort, and that was to be paid for. If anyone guessed that I was a German soldier, I would be executed. And my exposure could come from anywhere, whether it was an NKVD agent, or one of the officers, or even one of my friends. One mistake, and it would all be over. Deaths in the camp were common. Some couldn't survive the quarantine. Some died from malnutrition and disease, some because they didn't follow the rules. Every day there was a report of a dead person found in the barracks or on the camp grounds. After that, it was necessary to take care of the corpse, and this work fell on the shoulders of the prisoners themselves. Such labor was grueling, especially for people exhausted by hunger, disease, and physical punishment. The ground was mostly still frozen and hard. Shovels and pickaxes were icy cold, and they were hard to handle as they dug into the stone and frozen soil. Too much work was demanded of the men, and they had too little strength left. And these men were all too aware of how close the day was when they themselves would have to lie down in one of these pits. The graves were located near the camp. The prisoners who dug them were watched very closely. But even with such strict measures, one day 2 of them managed to escape. Both were married. One had 4 children, the other 2. A camp guard was sent to catch them. 4 days later, the fugitives were caught and brought back to the camp. On March 8, about a month before I met Bruno, they were tried in a public trial, which was to be attended by all the camp inmates. In Russia, it is generally accepted when the people are involved in problems of justice. The role of judges was played by senior NKVD officers. They sat on the balcony of the main administrative building, the only 2-story building in the camp. The balcony overhung a large open area almost the size of a town square, where it was customary to gather large masses of people on such occasions. Though thousands of people stood huddled together in the square, there was a strange silence. The officers left the second floor of the building and took their seats on the balcony. The camp commander summoned the first defendant, and the escort led him to the place of trial. The camp commander ordered the accused to state his case. He stood up in a loud voice, so that he could be heard by all those present in the square, began to explain his actions. He told the judges how in 1941 he had served in the Red Army, and during the battle for Kiev, he had been captured by the Germans. The Germans released him, and he went to his hometown. There he took a job with the German administration as an interpreter, as he knew a little German. I started working there to feed my family, he defended himself, and I am not ashamed before my people. The trial was swift, and the man was sentenced to 3 years in the camps, first because he was recognized as a German spy, and second because he had tried to escape. The judge stood up and read the verdict. Then he asked everyone if they agreed with this verdict. All in quiet voices expressed their understanding. Then it was time for the second defendant to stand trial. He told the court that he was 26 years old, had a wife and 2 children. He then told the court his story. Before 1933, my parents had their own farm and about 12 hectares of land. One day, the communists came to our house and announced that in the name of the state they were taking away our property. They took away horses and cows and everything we had. When my father tried to resist, he was sentenced to 10 years. I was 15 years old at the time. There were 6 children in our family. We were deprived of our father and forced out of the house. Then we were moved to another village, 30 kilometers away from ours, where we were forced to work in a labor camp. We had no possessions except for the clothes that were left on us. We all lived in one small room in that camp. In 1940, I joined the Red Army, and another year later the war with Germany began. I deserted and volunteered to join the Germans. Anyone in my place would have done the same. In the army, we were treated very badly, and for the slightest offense, anyone would be sent to Siberia. I no longer wanted to fight for the Communist Party. Shortly after I became a German prisoner of war, I was allowed to leave my place of imprisonment. As I was ordered, I immediately registered at the police station in my town. When the Germans retreated, I was arrested and sent to this camp. I fled from here because I don't belong here. I declare to you all that I will not defend my country until my father is returned to our family. The judge stood up and pronounced the sentence. Within 24 hours, this man is to be hanged here in the camp. It was a way of showing all the prisoners how severe the punishment could be. The judge went on to say that such people had no place in a Soviet country. He asked the crowd if they agreed with the verdict, and everyone said yes. The next day, a gallows was erected, and then early in the morning at 4 o'clock that man was hanged. After the rising, many people gathered around the gallows to watch what was happening, and before their eyes stood a direct witness to what the consequences of disobedience could be. The administration left the body, this terrible deterrent, hanging for 24 hours. About this time, a major purge of prisoners began. During the first half of April 1944, about 7,000 people were sent from our camp to camps in Siberia. The sentences for these people could vary from 3 to 20 years. Among those condemned were high-ranking Russian officers. Another 3,000 people were sent from the camp to the front in penalty units. These were people who had worked for the Germans in their labor camps during the occupation. Some of them were forced to work in German mines under heavy guard. Despite the exodus of so many prisoners, the camp remained severely overcrowded. Conditions were comparatively better in the barracks, where there were fewer mouths to feed and more space for the prisoners to sleep. I continued to perform my duties almost mechanically. I did not complain, but neither did I try to stand out. I often thought about the fate of my comrades in the German army. Where was the front now? Very little news from the front reached the camp. Most of the news I managed to get was that the Russians were gaining the upper hand and driving the German troops back from Moscow. I didn't know how much I could trust this, as I was sure that the information was reaching us in a filtered form and that it may even have been fabricated to keep morale up. The only thing I could be firmly sure of was that the German troops were far away from these places.